Hello and welcome to Money Reimagined. I'm Sheila Warren. As we transition into the spring, slowly, there's a big topic top of mind with the crypto community. That's right, tax season. Now, regular listeners of this show will know that I am somewhat obsessed with taxes. They shape so much of our policies and institutions, and they've been at the center of some of the fiercer debates around crypto. For example, those who followed the infrastructure bill discussions may recall that the controversial reporting requirements had a lot to do with the potential tax revenue that could come from crypto transactions, which the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated would bring in nearly $28 billion over the next 10 years. In the end, the infrastructure bill did make it out with a provision that requires, quote, crypto brokers to report customers' crypto transactions starting in January of 2023. This will happen through a form that's a staple in the traditional financial world, the 1099-B. To get a little wonky here for a second, the 1099-B is a form that reports capital gains and losses, usually for securities or properties. This is how the government knows how much a person has earned or lost, which is key to establishing their overall income for tax liability purposes. But as we'll dive into over the course of this episode, things may not be so simple for the crypto world. Surprise, surprise. As we've seen many times before, this is an example of retrofitting old rules and concepts to the completely new world of digital assets. Needless to say, taxing crypto is a complicated prospect, opening up a range of challenges with regards to tracking and valuing transactions and figuring out where the lines ought to be between the need for accurate, accountable reporting and that fundamental principle of crypto, privacy. We'll be diving into these during this week's conversation. Now, I will reluctantly concede that I'm somewhat alone in my interest, nay, obsession with taxes. It's not exactly everyone's favorite dinner table topic. But I feel validated that CoinDesk has recognized its importance in designating this week as Tax Week. As in other theme weeks on the site, readers can access a host of insightful articles and content that delve into the challenges posed by taxation and some of the solutions being offered up. In addition to being surprisingly readable, there's a real news you can use aspect to the package for this time of year. One of today's guests has contributed to that package. David Kemmerer is co-founder and CEO at CoinLedger, formerly known as Crypto Trader Tax. He penned an op-ed for CoinDesk that looks in more detail at the 1099-B requirement. David points out in his piece a core problem with these reporting requirements, that to force brokers to seek out and deliver information that would properly calculate the profit or loss on digital assets would undermine the privacy aspect of crypto transactions. And that's kind of the point. That's why we're also bringing in Dan Jeffries, a popular blogger and podcaster and another contributor to Tax Week. Dan looks at future trends with the special lens of privacy. And in an op-ed for last month's CoinDesk theme, Privacy Week, he painted a grim picture of Web2's privacy invasions, but also offered a hopeful vision of how crypto-driven inventions, like, for example, ZK Snarks, could offer a way out. I'm excited about this interesting pairing, but before we get to our guests, let's bring in my co-host, Michael Casey. Hey, Michael.
Hi, Sheila. Taxes.
I mean, you joke, but they really are the underpinning of our financial system.
I get it. I understand. You know, people don't know. This is actually something that being in the blockchain space has taught me. So taxation is an element of accounting. It's a hard one to admit. I was actually an accountant at a brief period of my life. When I left college, my first job out of college, and I just had to run away. It drove me nuts. I traveled.
Nowadays of youth, you chose accounting.
It is. People do find that a rather hard one to reconcile, but it was actually valuable because it did just teach me a lot. And it's interesting, once I finally got around to embracing, crypto and looking at sort of the idea of record keeping, and I realized accounting's like critical to civilization, actually. Like the very first ledgers in history go back to the Sumerian tablets. And so I can think about taxes in that same framework, perhaps, right? That there's this sort of like core element. In fact, people talk a lot about taxation power of governments actually being this one thing that makes fiat currency almost unbreakable as the foundational aspect of how we use our money. And that's one of the challenges I think that sort of decentralized cryptocurrencies face, is they don't have that power. And so how we deal with that is actually a very, very core problem. So we can dismiss this as being something that's like death and taxes, inevitable, but we don't want to talk about it. But really, really actually very core to some of these basic ideas about how money sits within society. So I think
fundamentally, right, the very idea of taxation runs a bit counter to privacy. The idea that you are responsible for reporting your earnings on a very personal level, right? Like the source of those earnings and the timing of those earnings in many cases to the government. I mean, that's something that people don't necessarily think about, but there's a there's some tenets of privacy that are kind of being outlined there, right? Some assumptions about what should be private and what shouldn't be private that we've agreed to as part of a functioning society. So really looking forward to getting into all this with our guests today. And so David, why don't we bring you in first? And maybe you can just kind of address this core problem of the reporting that you talk about a bit in your piece, between the movement of assets into self-custodial wallets and exchanges and all of this. Why don't you walk us through all that?
Yeah, your opening monologue was spot on. Essentially, what we're seeing, and it's not a surprise that we're seeing it, is regulators are really starting to pay attention to digital assets now, much more so than when I first got in the space, call it 5 years ago. And that's not a surprise. They're trying to fit current regulation that applies to similar types of property, right? Crypto and equity stocks, right? They're both forms of property. They're actually taxed very similarly. So it makes sense why the IRS sees this and they kind of want to, retrofit the same types of rules that equity brokers are subject to when it comes to reporting the transaction history and the capital gains and income for their users onto this Web3 kind of crypto world. But as I mentioned in my piece, it breaks down in how crypto is fundamentally built, right, on these decentralized technologies, right? That's a buzzword, but it's true, right? Blockchains enable, and they kind of break down these third parties that no longer have to exist to facilitate these types of transactions. And so when you try to require these 1099B reporting requirements onto crypto brokers like Coinbase or Gemini or BlockFi, whoever it might be, they're not going to have all the information that's needed to actually be helpful to taxpayers and to the IRS. So it presents a very, very big problem. And it's, my prediction that, as these get rolled out for tax year 2023, there's just going to be an unbelievable amount of confusion and pain that taxpayers who operate, within the cryptocurrency world are going to have to face.
So what is the way out of this? I mean, unbelievable amount of pain and confusion doesn't sound very enticing. What is, surely we're going to bring Dan in shortly to talk about what he sees as solutions generally, I think, for privacy challenges in the world at large. But is there a happy medium there? Is there any willingness amongst the authorities to recognize this square peg is being jammed into a round hole and they're going to have to come up with something that actually has at least some respect for those privacy challenges? How do we get out of this? What's the compromise solution?
Unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be some sort of compromise solutions until there's pain felt, right? Because this problem is not widespread enough yet. It's going to become widespread enough. And as soon as millions of Americans are kicking and screaming and making a lot more noise to politicians, that's going to draw their attention. But I sit in a unique spot. I can maybe see what's coming because of the business that we've built, but I'm not sure anything in the next couple of years before this gets rolled out will solve for this. Now, I do think there's things that can be done that can bring sensible regulation into the space and still satisfy what, of course, the IRS is trying to do, which is make sure people are paying their appropriate taxes for the income that they generate. But as you guys mentioned at the start, we do run into this unique dynamic where parts of crypto are competitive and at odds with governments, right? And there's no denying that. And so I don't have all the answers as to how these things will coexist. And so I don't have great answers of what can we do now? Unfortunately, I think I don't see a way out of, confusion and pain, but hopefully that will, like it always does, make people take a second look and think a little bit harder about certain things.
Yeah, but forcing change through pain is sometimes the only way, unfortunately. So Dan, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts specifically about resolving that particular dilemma when it comes to tax and, being compatible with what government's needs are. But one of the things that was, I think, compelling about your piece was that it did have there is a way out to the broader question of privacy and society's, I suppose, informational needs, right? This recognition that to function as a society, let's just set aside whether we mean government or not in that, but just that we all need to be able to share information with each other. But through zero knowledge proofs and ZK snarks, there are now methods by which we can, bring sufficient information to bear to actually resolve some of those challenges, but at the same time, protect privacy. So can you just walk through what that's all about, ZK snarks in particular, and then maybe entertain how, if at all, any of these sorts of solutions would apply to the tax dilemma that David was outlining?
I think, look, there's a couple of articles in recent days, one that we talked about ZK snarks, right? And we talked about privacy and, whether I was bullish on it over the next 20 or 30 years. And I think the answer is I'm bullish in some areas and really not bullish at all in other areas. In other words, I think we have the solutions to be able to create incredibly functional privacy-based systems. And I think we've been fighting that battle for years. It goes back to the Clipper chip, and you still have the same thing. Like we just got new suitcases, for travel, and they've got the special TSA lock, which seemed like, a good idea at the time. They'll have a special screwdriver that no one else has. And now, of course, we have 3D printers, and any idiot can go and open that thing on you. So every time you put a back door in something, or every time, you screw it up for everybody, but there's always a short-sightedness, right? There's a desire to stop the bad guys, whoever the bad guys are defined at that moment in time. I like to say that trust is a moving concept, right? Do you trust XYZ institution? Do you trust the Justice Department, for instance? Are you trusting the Justice Department, that went after the Ku Klux Klan and destroyed it? Or are you talking about, in the 1870s, or are you talking about the Justice Department, in the 20s, that was one of the most corrupt ever and was taking a whole bunch of money from prohibition and doing things like that? The real idea is that it's individuals behind these things, right? And so that you don't trust it, you trust the people sort of behind it. And I think anytime there's back doors to privacy, I think anytime there's a desire to disrupt privacy, it can be abused, much later on. The ZK snarks are interesting in that we've only used them for creating kind of an analog to cash, right? As sort of private money, but they can do all kinds of things. Like you can create systems for logging into websites without ever sending a hash of the website over the wire, right? By basically just proving that the answer beyond a probabilistic shadow of a doubt. There's ways to do all the things that those early cypherpunks were talking about, right? Where you might share a bit of information with your doctor, and you might share a little bit more with the insurance company, but not the entire thing. You might share a bit more with someone else, right? You can kind of slowly open the kimono, if you will, and make it a need to know basis. And DARPA and organizations are actually working on platforms like that. I think we've just been too narrow with it, and we've just been too narrowly focused on crypto. I don't think we've taken a big enough picture, and you can really build those systems that the cypherpunks were talking about. In the short term, though, the answer to the question is governments have no desire to compromise any of these things. They're going to retrofit the things there, right? In my last article, The Automatic Tax Man Cometh, it's going to be easier to take taxes out, whether you like it or not. And the things are changing. It started as very libertarian movement, but how a movement starts and how it develops as more and more people get into the system are very different things. And the only way that it changes is when something I've said for years, the crypto ecosystem has got to grow into something where you have a bunch of industries that are not just trading money, right? And trading a couple of JPEGs. It's got to be something where you have businesses that are huge, driving real value, and therefore have economic power to negotiate with other power. Period. There's no, oh, we're going to come to a compromise. Why? Why does anyone come to a compromise when they hold all the cards and you hold none? That's essentially where it stands right now. And they'll retrofit crappy policies onto the current thing as much as they want. And they won't think it through at all because it's something that's brand new and, quite frankly, in many ways is threatening, to the way that they view the world. So why would they compromise in any way in the short term?
And that's practical and a bit depressing, I suppose. I can't really argue with that. I think I really do want to kind of go a little bit deeper into kind of this fundamental concept that there are certain areas of privacy that we just have kind of ceded, right? And I think taxation is one of them. When I think about what goes into an ordinary tax form, leaving aside 1099s and 1099B even securities or property, just regular income statements, the amount of information that is given by any employer to the government on behalf of an employee, whether it's withholding or whatever it might be, and the kind of ability you have to make choices around that. If you're an ordinary income earner, I'm not talking about somebody that can afford an army of folks who can like go get in there and figure out how to avoid paying any taxes whatsoever, which I also have strong feelings about, by the way, in terms of being quite irresponsible. Nevertheless, it is it's a bit odd. And I do think that when you bring that system and you contrast it with the entire notion that we are trying to land and build and secure, I would even say, within Web3 and within the blockchain ecosystem, those are fundamentally at odds. So I guess I'm asking more of a philosophical question, and I guess maybe I'll address this at you, David. Do you think there is a policy path, and you talked about this a little bit, but let's go into some more detail, that can chart those two things, right? The real need for the government to kind of recognize that where income is earned, the government has an interest and can use its taxation authority and power, which is given by the Constitution, to make something of that on behalf of the United States of America financially, with the kind of reason that a lot of people turn to these kinds of systems in the first place, which is at least pseudonymity, if not anonymity, depending on the choices that you're making.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that we could like unpack there. I do think there's a way to coexist, but in the limit, like let's say 50 many years out, I do see cloud communities and digital asset, like these new technologies, as becoming competitive to governments as we know them today. That does not mean governments are going to stop existing, in my view. I think new types of governments are going to pop up that look very different than the governments that we've known for the past, call it, couple hundred years. Now, it'll be a long, bumpy, winding road to get there. Maybe we won't get there. This is my personal opinion. But the way that technologies and these types of technologies especially are being developed, I do think in the long term, they are competitive with governments as we know them today. So I don't know if you'd want to like unpack that all, or if that answers your question, but I do think they're at odds.
Well, let's unpack it. Why not? That's the beauty of this podcast. I mean, it's a huge question, right? That like, is the end game here? Throw it out there.
Yeah. So I think the end game is, we've built new digital economies that have all sorts of value, true economies, right, that are operating digitally. You could say the smallest form of that right now is Axie Infinity, right? That's doing billions of dollars in transaction volume. And there's true value that have been created in this little digital world, right? People are willing to trade money for these digital assets. And so I think if you take that way into the limit, the members of that new community are going to decide how they want to be governed, right? This is what you see with the governance protocols and all this experimentation. I just see the road that we're going, the tax, it'll be more like value add tax, where like, it's like sales tax, right? The community decides, hey, every time you spend money in our community, whether it's Axie Infinity, it won't be that right in the future, but whatever your cloud community is, 0.02% goes into the treasury, which is used to fund all sorts of things for the benefit of the greater good, right? This is how governments are set up today. But as we move into these new digitally native environments, it doesn't make sense that my rules should only be dictated based on where I physically live in Austin, Texas, right? Why can't I be in a community with someone from, Europe or New York, right? And we have our own system of how we want to be governed. I think it's very abstract. I think there's a lot of very, very smart people who have talked about very similar things like this. But then pulling back to more the day-to-day at the ground level today, a simple solution that would potentially solve some of these cost basis issues with 1099B is like, hey, let's just do a gross proceeds B. Now we're flipping back, where Coinbase, you're only in charge of reporting, the total sales that your customers did on Coinbase platform. We're not going to try to make you report cost basis for, what happened on Uniswap or Gemini, but, we want the information on the income for the gross proceeds. And then same with all the other folks. But yeah, like I wrote in my piece, the genie is out of the bottle on these technologies. They want to be decentralized, and I think even if heavy-handed regulators like the United States come in and force brokers to operate differently so that they can accurately report tax information, the United States isn't the only country in the world. And so I think other countries will see that as an opportunity to attract capital, talent. And so that's, again, you start playing out that mind game of like, well, how does this really evolve? And I don't see a way that this doesn't become competitive with governments as we know them today.
So a couple of things. So I certainly consider myself, a more global citizen than not, and certainly, understand the importance of coordination of global policy. It's something we talk about a lot on the show. Nevertheless, I do live in the city of San Francisco, and therefore there are certain services the city of San Francisco does provide to me as a literal physical resident of this space. And so I think one of the interesting things that's going to be coming, it's already happening, and is an ongoing debate. This is what a lot of tax and trade treaties are about, right? Is like, where is your income taxed? Is it taxed? And that there's a lot of very interesting corporate maneuvering around where corporations ought to be taxed. And individuals, a lot of folks, you have to kind of be very mindful of if you're a resident of state Y for some period of time, you can be taxed in state Y and in state X as your state of main residence. And so a lot of people have to track this, and especially with the pandemic, there's been a lot of interesting stuff going on, people kind of relocating for some time and then moving back or keeping a residence in, different places or whatnot, to be closer to family or whatever. And then that affecting where they have to file state and local taxes. And so I do think that it's just important to land that point. Like we may, think of ourselves as members of a community that is global or that is largely digital, where we may even be literally nomads, where we're roaming around from place to place. Nevertheless, for most people, it's going to remain the reality that there is one place that they have their physical being does spend more time than not, and that there are services they are using that are government provided. I don't see that changing like ever, basically, literally ever, except for maybe people who are so ridiculously stratospherically wealthy that they can kind of escape, hit terminal escape velocity on some of these things. But for the most part, that's the reality. And so I do think that when you're talking about transaction value that is exchanged purely online, where there's a person who maybe at the moment that they realize those gains, they're in Puerto Rico or the Bahamas versus in California or New York, right? There's an interesting question as to where ought that to be landed? Like who actually who's the taxation authority that ought to be pursuing the receipt of whatever can be realized on those funds? And this is kind of somewhat unsettled. There's ongoing debate around, we won't go into like use taxes versus sale tax or anything like this. We don't necessarily have to go into, the registrations you have to do. For example, if you're a charity and you're doing general solicitation of fundraising, technically you're supposed to register in all 50 states. That rarely happens because people tend to kind of do it at the end. They'll look and see, where did I get a bunch of money from? I'll kind of register in those places going forward, as opposed to being universal about it. I just see this as being so incredibly complicated going forward, because the idea of where you reside and where your assets reside and separately, in many cases, the third place where you realize income could be three different things. So I guess I'm just curious, what the privacy implications are for that, Daniel, maybe over to you. Just kind of like right now, we generally, self-identify as being residents of a certain state, and we have some choice over the matter. We have to have an address and certain kinds of other markers. For the most part, you can decide where you live if you're a citizen of the United States of America. You can make that choice. But digitally, maybe you can't. Maybe it'll be the case that if you work with an exchange that's HQ'd in Delaware or HQ'd in the Bahamas or HQ'd in California, you are necessarily going to be considered a resident of that state. I don't even know how to think about all of this and the privacy implications that attend there too. So maybe, Dan, we'll go over to you, just general comments on once your location moves into virtual land, let's call it the metaverse for sake of argument. What does that mean in terms of your ability to kind of mask where your physical location might be for security reasons that might be very real?
Well, as a full-time nomad, I think about this stuff a lot because I don't actually have a physical address, and I travel every couple of months, and I do it all around the world. And it's given me a good perspective on the power that individual nation states have over everyone's life, and that how arbitrary some of those powers can be in individual places and the policies can be. I do think that crypto, for instance, has the power to change some of these things that we do with privacy. I think it has the power to change the way that governments work over a very, very, very long time horizon. We're not talking about 25 years or 50 years. We're talking about hundreds of years, right? And governments have changed in the past. The idea that we all live under a nation state with, a patriotic song and a flag and a sports team in our individual, state or whatever it is a very new way of being, right? For thousands of years, people had either smaller tribes or city states or kind of their borders changed overnight when ex-conqueror came in and killed all the old guys and then took over and changed the monetary supply again and put his face on it, and then changed next year when the next conqueror came in and killed that guy, right? So borders shifted a lot more in the past, and your idea of an attachment to a nation state was slimmer. Now the nation state is the dominant form in the world, and it's incredibly powerful. The economists have talked about that they're only getting bigger, they're not getting smaller. And the idea that any state in the current thing, I'm sorry, David, would allow you to voluntarily choose who you associate with, then not sure that you are understanding the power of the nation state currently, which is basically the ability to kick in your door with guns and tell you which people you're going to associate your money with. So I think the challenge of it, of course, is that over time, though, I think it is possible what you're talking about. In other words, that we can start to say that there's a more internationalization of how we see ourselves. And I would love to be able to see myself as an international citizen. But the fact is, I still end up paying taxes in one area or another, or I end up having to be a resident of one area in order to get medical attention or to get these types of things. It's super confusing, and no government on the earth is prepared to deal with it in the current state. I think it can change, but I think it actually changes with, larger forms of nation states banding together almost into and acting kind of like the EU, right? Where each one is in a sense working as a collective, right? And each one is kind of a sub-state. And as money internationalizes, because it's not just going to be crypto, it's going to be central bank digital currencies that are probably the first form of international currencies. And believe me, they're going to have a panopticon into everyone's life and where that money is going, especially when they kill off physical cash, which is absolutely inevitable in the next 20 to 25 years. There will be no physical cash, right? And maybe we're lucky that crypto acts as a parallel economic operating system to those things, right? And does provide that sort of privacy, because there's enough, if you put too much pressure on the system and people don't have any outlet to do things, and anything can be sort of, geo-fenced off, or then you start to see kind of a steam burst pop up somewhere else. And so I think there is a pendulum swing that eventually happens over a long enough period of time. But in the current state, nation states are all powerful. And if you have any doubts of it, try crossing a border to another one and try to become just sort of an international citizen. You'll see how difficult it is, right? It's just something where you will end up being somewhere. I think crypto makes it easier to pay those taxes. I mean, once everything is digital, once there isn't cash, once you have central bank digital currencies become the default in 25 to 30 years, which they will. All of a sudden now you have smart contracts that pay your taxes. So essentially, your taxes are taken out automagically. And if you want to complain about it, you can call a helpline and complain about it for a while and wait for your money to come back to you. And if we think that crypto is going to save us from that, then you can just mandate with a law that, if you're collecting Bitcoin or Ethereum or any other crypto that's coming out, that you're doing some kind of goods and service purchase, you have to have a smart contract that essentially takes part of it out for the government. So I don't think it saves us in the short term. Long term, maybe it evolves as we become more internationalized and we think of ourselves in that way. But I can tell you that 99.99% of the planet fully self-identifies with being an individual in physical space in one place for most of their life. And the idea that, the 0.1% of us are sort of running around, from place to place on the earth, we'll be able to change that policy in the near term, I think is unlikely.
Okay, so lots to unpack there. So I first of all, I think it's just useful to clarify because when you use crypto here, Dan, I think that word can be used in different ways, right? You were talking about the technology of crypto that is, I agree, it's actually the underpinning of CBDCs. Like people will say central bank digital currency is not crypto. It absolutely is, right? And it does have the powers that you're talking about. It will have smart contracts. And so what you're saying, if I can paraphrase you, is that crypto, in fact, will make the effort for the government to track us and extract taxes from us actually easier, not worse. It'll be the opposite of what, say, the cypherpunk dream would be. But that ultimately the system and, maybe backlash and all of the sort of angst and everything that comes with that excessive power will push us to this other world, right? Is that a reasonable summary?
Yeah. In other words, yes, it goes in the direction. The pendulum swings in one direction, then it swings back, right? We go from centralized to decentralized and back again in history. And when it pushes back in the other direction, when you put too much pressure on it, right? Like, if the left or the right, for instance, gets full power, right, then it becomes an unbalanced system, right? It becomes a system that, essentially gets all of its policy desires, right, and then kind of crushes the other needs for expression within the society. And then eventually that kind of has to burst up in a different way. So I see that happening is that if you crush cash and you crush the ability to have any sort of privacy whatsoever, and you enforce everything with smart contracts, at some point, there is a steam burst. There is sometimes a desire to disagree with the current policies of society, and where the vast majority of people want to disagree with it. You can think about it during the time of slavery, when there was a huge pendulum switch to the idea that the vast majority of people didn't want that. You can see it with marijuana policy, in the way it's changed dramatically over the course of like many years, right? And so there has to be some kind of technological change that kind of affects it in the long term as well, once we've kind of gone down this path of it just being a hell of a lot easier, frankly, to extract those taxes from everyone. And maybe society becomes more transparent at that point, as kind of the older generation is replaced, and a younger generation that grows up with these technologies is no different from a tree or a bicycle to them. They've grown up with it their whole life, that it starts leading to more transparency and some desire for privacy after all that privacy has essentially been destroyed.
So I'd like to just pick up on some of that there, Dan, maybe add a bit of commentary. And I want to bring in David and talk specifically about some of these practical aspects of smart contracts and how they could function in a taxation environment. But I think it's just useful to recognize that there's different conceptualizations of what a government does and what the role of the state. And, it's funny, I used to live in Argentina, and Argentines would say, you sort of Americans, you think that the government is an extension of you, that it is representative, and therefore whatever's happening is acting in interest. He said in Argentina, we see it as the mafia. It is constantly in battle with us. And so paying your taxes is something you reluctantly do. For the most part, you avoid it because they are the bad guys, right? And this conceptualization of the state as the other is a legitimate take for an Argentine. I often feel like this is the challenge of Western civilization. It's like, how far do we move from that extreme? How far do we go from people assuming that this is all in our common interest to being one that's against mine? And so I just think it's really important to sort of problematize, or not problematize, but just address it, what you were talking about there, Dan, from that perspective, because it's not always the bad guy, right? And it is San Francisco that provides those services and so forth. And one of the things I often think about is we can think of, any crypto system, Bitcoin is one, as having its own is sort of like taxation and services function already, right? We have, there are Bitcoin rewards that are essentially, a dilution of my holdings, and therefore I'm paying a price through that seigniorage to the validators for the miners for what they're doing, and that's valid. But at the same time, there's all these externalities that occupies a massive amount of conversation, particularly, energy usage, and then ultimately impact on the environment and so forth. And how do we actually pay for that, right? And that's what a government traditionally often steps in, is to sort of help for those things. So, so I just think it's fascinating. I'm not saying that, you are right or wrong. I think this pendulum swing that you're referring to has to be understood somewhat in that context. I know I should probably ask you for a reply, but I do want to bring David in, so I'm just going to monopolize my microphone here and do so. But David, just maybe on that very much more practical point, right? This idea that Dan was outlining, that crypto could be useful to the process of taxation, whether you want it or not, and make it easier. How far away from that? How does that play out? And are we going to see a world where there'll be this automatic smart contract structured thing, and we all just let the system extract those taxes from us as it's designed?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what is likely going to happen. I think I would just have differing views of how that may evolve, right? I think it's interesting, right? I don't know if anyone on this call would say governments are bad. Like, I think governments are good, but I think if they're left in uncheck for long enough and they don't actually have to compete with anyone, complacency can sink in and they don't maybe do as good of a job serving their constituents, right? And so I think, again, when I'm playing this mind game and the game theory of how this evolves, I think COVID is a great example to help extrapolate from, right? Because pre-COVID, right, your physical location of where you worked was so important, right? That metric has skyrocketed in terms of how much time we spend online. We no longer have to commute to an office. So now you see state governments competing for employees with each other. You look what Miami has done, really, like literally trying to poach talent from San Francisco. Now these governments are having to compete, right? I would argue that that is a good thing. But now what happens when that competition happens at a global scale and this trend of us living our lives online continues to accelerate and we see less and less value from physically being somewhere? Sheila, you're totally right. We will never be non-physical beings. But I just think if you extrapolate this trend and if you believe this trend of these cloud communities, such an abstract concept, will continue, I don't see a world where these governments start aggressively competing. And what happens when that starts happening? Well, look what Portugal is doing. They're like, hey, no taxes on crypto. No, right? What happens when that's global and, Dan can go anywhere and live anywhere? I just don't think governments as we know them today in the very long term, we're all on the same page there. This isn't happening overnight. I don't see how that doesn't change.
Well, I do think you're going to see governments starting to compete the way they compete with businesses, right? And we had a whole episode on Ireland, Michael, where we talked about some of the approaches they took to tax, which is not necessarily the major reason that companies reload or HQ'd in Ireland, but certainly didn't hurt matters. And similarly, I think you're going to start seeing that for the digitalati, right? Like people who actually are working primarily in the digital space, whether they're making their money passively or whether they're making their money very actively, but who can be, self-described, Dan, the way you are, nomads who can kind of work from anywhere and have a lot of flexibility. I think there is going to be some competition for those folks. And I think you're going to see immigration policy reflecting that, and you're going to see taxation policy reflecting that. And that's not dissimilar from what happened in the 60s in the US, where there was this big call for medical professionals to come from all around the world, and only they were allowed in the country, et cetera, right? Both for income generation reasons, because they were higher income earners that could pay more taxes, but because there was a shortage of medical professional staff, and it was considered that was really important for American society. So we're going to see that kind of thing happening for sure. But there are always going to be a tremendous number of people, far more people than not. And I think this is true no matter how far out you look on the time horizon, who are going to be rooted to the land for whatever reason. Maybe it's ancestral, maybe it's historical, maybe it's that they would have to bring a giant group of people with them that not all can travel in that way. People care a lot about families. They care a lot about community. They care a lot about all of these things. They care about nature. As we see climate change, we can't ignore climate change. There'll be less and less livable land for more and more people. What's that going to do? So all these things, I think, over the time horizons you're talking about are going to be major factors that play into, what are the reasons people choose to leave the place that maybe they've been for some time and go somewhere else. And we've talked a lot about immigration as a general matter on the show, and kind of how it is a forcing function in many ways, right? For other kinds of changes and other kinds of things to happen, whether that's people who don't want to leave because they're having a lifestyle where they have to go to make more income. If they can suddenly stop doing that and need to cross the border to feed their families, or if they're able to work from a place that's maybe more desirable for whether or whatever reasons, or closer to family or whatever it is, because they're able to do that because of the nature of their work. And that's going to be more and more enabled the further we get into the Web3 metaverse, all of the above, right? Kind of world that we're entering. So I think the question of what's going to follow what, is tax policy going to be a driver of change? Is it going to attract people or repel people? Or is it going to be something that kind of follows as you see more and more? We see this regulation. So you've got certain jurisdictions, Bermuda, the Bahamas, very crypto friendly, right? Miami, right? They're kind of they're deliberately trying to draw that specific kind of talent and sensibility to their jurisdiction. There are others that really don't care, or are in fact trying to repel that sort of element, that kind of the rabble rousing element, let's say, of crypto folks, right, from their jurisdictions. But most people, I think, aren't kind of paying the right attention. So I actually think that you're going to see tax policy that follows a bit the tracks that people who are crypto native, and I agree with, I think it was you, Dan, who said this is going to be demographic. So younger generations who are raised to be crypto native, where they choose to settle and make their homes and lives, I think is going to be something that's going to force a reckoning with what ought our tax policy to be now that we have an influx of these folks for whatever reason. And I think you're seeing that a bit reactively in some places. I don't know that I would say that Austin is necessarily trying to draw crypto talent. It's drawing tech talent and has been for a while. But as crypto talent moves there, you're going to have to figure out, like, are you going to be issuing state level? I mean, this is Texas, so the answer is no. But, if it were not like Texas, which is kind of anti-state income tax, would you be issuing some sort of taxation on this stuff, particularly as you get more and more of that being the source of income for a lot of people? So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how this develops over time. When I think about this, I don't even try to predict 25 years out, like some of the time horizons we're talking about here. I'm even looking like 2 to 3 to 5 years out, right? Are we going to see this continuing influx of folks into the Miamis of the world and places that are trying to draw the sort of talent? Or are we going to see people maybe reverting and moving back to, where they grew up, their families, their other networks, whatever else it might be? And how's that going to affect people that don't have the ability to be mobile in that way, who are being left out a bit from this entire new economy that's being developed online? What's going to happen to all of them, right? Are they going to be left holding the bag on having to provide then services for maybe even more people who aren't accessing this kind of wealth generation, which is like kind of unprecedented? I don't know. Michael, I'm sure you have thoughts on all this. I'm curious to see what what's your
first of all, let's bring our guests in. Like I don't know. I think that how we divvy up the goods, the winners and losers. I mean, Dan, there often feels in crypto that there's a winner takes all element to all this. And taxes have traditionally been a way for addressing those distortions. How do you see fairness, I suppose, playing out in all of this in a crypto context?
Well, look, there's a number of different things here, right, that we've kind of touched on. Number one, we are seeing kind of a rewriting of work. David is totally correct, in terms of thinking about there is sort of a rewriting of how a lot of people do work. And I would think there's kind of a division between sort of knowledge workers and folks who are sort of physically rooted to their job. And there's always going to be people who are physically rooted to their job. And also, like, my lifestyle, for instance, where I travel all the time and people go, oh, that's amazing, I wish I could do that, but I've got XYZ job or kids or blah, blah, blah. My wife is tied to this, my husband's tied to this, et cetera. My kids are tied to this school. There's a lot of things that physically tie us to the world. I just went to a storage unit that I had for 4 years and finally cleaned it out. And I called the junk calling service and hauled away 99% of it. I don't even know who that person is anymore, but the vast majority of people, that stuff is a gigantic anchor that keeps them where they're at. And so I think you're going to continue to have that. But governments, by the way, have always competed for talent in a lot of different areas. Like if you look at immigration policy, let's be honest, there's the super rich person policy where they're like, great, you can get in here next week as long as you invest $1 million. There's the super talented people, policy that's like, great, you can come in here through the special door, and we really need talent in whatever it is today, nursing or tech or artificial intelligence or soldiers or whatever it is during this course of time. That changes based on the people. And there's that special door. There's the door for the average person, and there's a door for people whoever that government labels undesirable, which makes it as tough as possible and imposes all kinds of restrictions on there. And so I think there is kind of these divides between these different folks. And I think it's very hard to say like what the policies will be. The problem is when you do have this rewriting of work, and you have a lot of people who actually don't need to go in one city. We're already seeing kind of the death of certain cities or cities and go into a period of decline. San Francisco's talked a lot about right now. Of course, San Francisco and every city goes through a lot of different ups and downs. This idea that it's like suddenly gone for good and there's no way it ever revives is kind of ridiculous. It's gone through a number of different evolutions from the turn of the century and Chinese immigration there and the battles with that, and then you have in the kind of Tong era, you have the era of like, sort of hippie movement going there and kind of revitalizing, and then you have a decline after that, and then you've got the tech movement, and then a decline again, right? So these things change over time. The thing that I'm concerned about is that if all the states do have to compete, I do agree it's a good thing. You have to provide different services, you have to provide different levels of taxes. The challenge is only that group that is mobile and the knowledge workers can take advantage of it. And if there's a brain drain in a lot of different areas, the people who are left holding the bag, right, are the ones who are rooted to those different areas. And if you can now work in any place, and it's no longer just a centralized city where they attract the minds who are those knowledge workers, and they say, look, and I'm already seeing it now with the very like artificial intelligence companies I do a lot of work with in my foundation. They're very international. They're hiring people internationally. They're hiring people over in the United States. It doesn't matter if you're in Idaho or if you're in San Francisco, and people are moving all over the place. And that's wonderful. The challenge, of course, is then if you're in an undesirable place or a place that was formerly desirable, how do the goods and services get paid for there? How do those people, right, not get their things paid for without the taxation or without which is fundamentally built upon where the person lives currently. That's really what it is all about. Everywhere in the world, it is about where you live. And so it is going to have to evolve in some way, because otherwise what you get is a super populist movement of people who are rooted in area, who are angry and who want to destroy everything, right? And in a way legitimately, right? Because they're not being serviced by an area, and their areas are in decline, and their smartest people from their families and their people with the most skills and the most adaptability are going to go move to any other area that they feel like and leave them, right? And so there does have to be a way that tax policy changes to reflect these new kind of movements. I don't know what the answer to those things is going to be, but it will happen organically over time. In other words, just like a river sort of finding its level over time, because it's going to have to, because you are right that the idea that there's going to be more knowledge workers who are able to move to a lot of different places is going to exist, but something is going to have to, we're going to have to be able to take care of the people who can't move around all the time, because they're just as valuable to society, right? Both sides are incredibly valuable, and you have to develop a policy in a way of viewing the world that addresses everyone, or you have a very unbalanced society that becomes, what Michael was talking about, where you have kind of the dark side of it, the Argentinian government, where it's like the mafia and it doesn't serve you at all, right? Governments are not inherently good; they're inherently neutral, and they can go from evil, at one extreme, right, to the Nazis, right, where we just enforce the policy on everyone, to totally corrupt, right, to really neutral, to very benevolent, where it serves the group of the people, and they can swing in the same thing back and forth. And one of the worst ways to allow it to happen is to create an imbalance that doesn't deal with the whole society as a whole.
Well, what I think we've definitely observed over the course of human history is that, government, to your point, is not always benevolent, surely. And it's not always benevolent to you, right? It's benevolent to perhaps someone, but that person is not always self-identified as someone that you see yourself as part of that community. So it's important when we set up these policies and think about what we're advocating for, to think about, what happens if it goes awry, and what happens if we find ourselves in that minority, usually, right, group that is not necessarily being prioritized or even seen in many cases by whoever is actively in power. And how do we make sure that we're protecting the rights of all, as we develop policies are going to have longstanding import to the way that we conduct ourselves, both as a society and individually, but also how we think about what we're doing with our financial resources. So, David, any final thoughts on any of this? I mean, we could go on for another hour, I know, but despite the illusion that tax is not a super sexy topic, I hope we certainly disproved that on this conversation. But David, would love to get some final thoughts from you as well.
No, I would agree with all of that. I think we're all just in very much agreement that the way things today work are probably not going to be the way they work 100 years from now. And we could go in and out of that time spectrum. It's very difficult to do. But I think you're exactly right. It's interesting to think through how something very pointed, like how you're going to pay your taxes, weaves in and out of that narrative. So I agree. We could probably talk about this for hours and get very, very meta about it all.
100%. Well, I couldn't have summed that up better myself. So thank you so much to our guests, David Kemmerer, Daniel Jeffries, for illuminating this often complex and abstruse topic of taxation authorities, and how they really do provide incentives for how we all interact, even in ways that we don't necessarily realize. Thanks also to my co-host, as always, Michael Casey, and to all of you, our loyal listeners. Come back next week for another episode of Money Reimagined.